I wanted to say, I've been doing the Thursday chats for, I guess we're into about 3 years worth, and it's a good while. So I was thinking, when can I find a topic that I would, you know, feel comfortable talking about, especially after hearing people like Alice and Sid and Herb and stuff like that. So, um, since I was cowardly to do it by myself, I asked somebody who really knows what they're talking about when it comes to tourism to talk with me today. So, today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about tourism, the anthropology of tourism, but we're going to be focusing on the career, the life of Valene Smith, who uh, died last year at the age of 98 and had a very profound influence in this very dynamic field. And so there was a chat, I mean, a paper session, and we're hoping to get a book together uh, that would document the influence that Valene L. Smith has had on the anthropology of tourism. And so today I've asked my colleague Carter Hunt, who is an associate professor at Penn State University, to talk with me a little bit about the anthropology of tourism by way of talking about this very famous, at least to those of us in the anthropology of tourism world, this very famous founding mother of our field. So I'm going to ask Carter to talk first. And, I've sent out the flyer a couple of times, so you may have seen his focus on it. But I think that instead of introducing him, I'm going to let Carter introduce himself, and then I will do the same on my part of it. We'll try and keep our remarks to about 30, 35 minutes together, and then we'll have comments, questions, answers, anything you want to talk about at that point. So at this point, then I'll just turn it over to Carter.
Well, good afternoon, folks, or whatever time zones you may be in. Um, I do have a few slides I'm going to work with today as I talk through some materials, and I'm going to go ahead and pull those up because in those slides I have an image. We'll come back to this title slide in a moment, but I wanted to share this image. I wanted to share this image because this is me, young Carter Hunt, pre-PhD, participating in Tim Wallace's ethnographic field school in Guatemala around the Lake Atitlan area back in 2003. And so while I had a chance in front of you folks, I wanted to start by thanking Tim, take that opportunity. Tim's one of the reasons I've been involved with anthropology in the first place. Had a lot to do with that field school. It was a big right turn in my career, as Bugs Bunny would have said. And he's consistently been amongst the small handful of folks that have really paid attention to my career as it's unfolded and been very supportive. He's been strongly encouraging all my interests along the way, including with this type of invitation today to interact with you folks, many of whom are going to be new acquaintances for me. So just want to say thanks, Tim, for the invite. Thanks you all for having me today as well. And you'll also, if you looked at our, title, we put all this info in there about tourism right out of the gates. So we're going to get to Valene Smith in a moment, but I wanted to start with a few slides here just to talk about this phenomenon of tourism, the magnitude and scope involved. We live in this age that's known as the Anthropocene. That overlaps largely with the Industrial Revolution time period of human history. But more recently, people have acknowledged an even more recent time frame since the 1950s, when that human impact on the planet has really skyrocketed. And that's called the Great Acceleration of the Anthropocene. You can see an article to the left there that established this idea of the Great Acceleration. And what's interesting is what I've highlighted in red there, that amongst all the indicators they could have chosen, they picked international tourism amongst those key indicators of this period of time when human impact really upticked on the planet. So that's one of the characteristics of this age we're living in, is really major scale magnitude of tourism. This shows those visitation rates, those international arrivals being projected across from the 1950s up to the current time frame and into the 2030s. We surpassed 1 billion international travelers in 2012. It's projected to get up to 1.8 billion international travelers by 2030. And one thing to keep in mind in here is that doesn't include the domestic travel. These are just the international numbers. So some people would estimate the domestic visitation being as much as 8 times the international travel. All these tourists are doing all kinds of things. There's new forms of tourism being identified every year. In addition to all of these leisure forms of travel, we have traveling for business and traveling to visit friends and family that would be different motives and would fall into different categories. But it's a huge array of types of activities and things that people are doing while they travel. So we have more people crossing international boundaries than ever, more than have occurred outside of war times as a function of tourism, as we can see from these anthropological quotes here. It's one of the largest forces for cultural and I would say ecological interaction that's ever existed in human history. It's gone on to become approximately 1 in 10 jobs on the planet, approximately 10% of global GDP. Those are numbers that could reach 85% of GDP in some small and developing countries. So this is a phenomenon that has massive implications for all kinds of things that would interest anthropologists. Scholars have picked up on this. There's actually as many as 285 active journals related to tourism, to hospitality, to events. This is a list that just shows the first few journals in that list in the A's category. I'd be happy to share that list if anybody wants to see that full list of activities. And what we really want to talk about, me and Tim today, I guess, is how this person, Valene Smith, saw all this coming and was paying attention to a lot of these issues long before anybody else was, before many of those journals existed and so forth. And the reason I started with this photo is because that's my PhD advisor sitting next to Valene Smith there. She was my conduit to Valene Smith. She invited me to join her at the conference that this photo was taken at. That was 2011 at Cal State Chico, and Valene was being honored because a museum of anthropology was dedicated in her name at the time. The attendees in that meeting included several luminaries in the field of tourism anthropology like Maggie Swain and Nelson Gravern. And to this day, this photo is one of the 2 photos that have been hanging in my office since I joined the faculty here at Penn State in 2013. And so as it was back in 2011, it's an honor to be presenting in honor of Valene Smith with you folks here today. So on to my topic. A lot of my research focuses on nature-based ecotourism. That's an idea that has inspired conservationists over the last 40 years. It's prompted politicians and planners to embrace it in some cases as a sustainable development strategy for the entire country, as we can see in the quote here from the former president of Costa Rica, who invited people to use the country as a laboratory for sustainable development and encouraged them to invest in ecotourism development at the time. Since some of the earliest writings on ecotourism, it was promoted as a win-win strategy for conservation and development among practitioners as well as among scholars. So we can see people here from different environmental NGOs advocating on behalf of ecotourism, calling it an alternative proposed as a means to link economic incentives with natural resources preservation and through the promotion of nature-based tourism. With increased tourism to parks and reserves, which are often located in rural areas, the populations surrounding the protected areas can find themselves employed through small-scale tourism enterprises. Greater levels of nature tourism can also have a substantial economic multiplier effect for the rest of the country. This was some of the dominant logic behind ecotourism development at this time frame. But for tourism scholars, ecotourism was fascinating for many reasons. And in some cases, we were interested in critiquing some of those claims and digging deeper and looking behind the facades of ecotourism. So we see lots of writings like these emerge, including many contributions of anthropologists, some of which are listed here, including Tim and Susan Stonich, some of you may know. But interestingly, in those early writings on ecotourism, specific use of the word ecotourism, we don't see Valene Smith represented in there. So even though ecotourism is not a term often cited among the many scholarly contributions she made, what I would like to argue is that she provided the conceptual groundwork for the ideas that were since incorporated into the canon of ecotourism scholarship. She wasn't a person that pulled punches in her criticism of certain forms of tourism, including ecotourism. She clearly held out hope for tourism done better, though. And in fact, she didn't just hope, but she demonstrated alternative ways of conducting tourism by running tourism businesses herself. As I hope to show here today, just as much of the contemporary tourism anthropology can be traced to her writings, so too can the anthropology of ecotourism specifically. So let's talk a little bit now about kind of some big picture issues in ecotourism research. A few years ago, Amanda, that was on the title slide with me there, and another colleague, we prepared a paper for the annual reviews of environment and resources that assessed the nature of the writing on ecotourism. We ended up identifying many problems and fallacies being perpetuated in that literature, and we proposed a research agenda and framework for conducting more rigorous analyses of ecotourism in the future. Here, I would like to quickly highlight some of those issues and the 6 research design principles we developed. Since the ecotourism term first appeared in the late 1980s, often attributed to being coined by a Mexican architect, Hector Ceballos Lascoren, ecotourism's appearance as a topic and in the titles of scholarly articles grew dramatically, as is evident in this data from the Web of Science that shows ecotourism and article titles and articles as a keyword. Serving as the tourism industry's response to our common future's call for sustainable development, stakeholders throughout the industry took on new responsibilities and roles in light of this sustainable development paradigm. Local communities partner with tour companies and NGOs, hoping to channel outside attention on their lands, traditions, and resources to positive changes for their community. Regional and national governments adopted discourses of using ecotourism to protect biodiversity and alleviate poverty. Tourists were encouraged to gaze more respectfully, listen more closely, ask where their money goes, and change their worldview. And NGOs increasingly served as mediators alongside stakeholders collaborating in new partnerships, lobbying for policies favorable to tourism, and promoting the idea of environmental responsibility in tourism. Yet by the early 2000s, scholars began to publish critiques of ecotourism, demonstrating that empirically, in practice, it did not always live up to its ideals. Some cited ecotourism as a vanguard activity likely to create a foothold in culturally and biologically sensitive areas that are later exploited through forms of mass tourism development. It is true that these individuals brought critical social theory to ecotourism, analyzing its meaning and effects as a Western phenomenon in relatively poor countries. Yet, as we noticed, despite sound internal logic, many have perspectives that seem to shift little from writing to writing, data set to data set. And as a conversation with Robert Fletcher, one of the authors listed here, provides some clarity. When asked how he remains so productive in his scholarship, Rob said, "I don't have data." So they're writing largely in conceptual and theoretical ways, and they have gauges that are kind of constantly pegged in the red, and their message becomes a bit repetitive and dismissive of important real-world contributions in relation to other conservation and development alternatives that might exist in tourism's absence. Rob might not have had a lot of data to write from, but one group of individuals that do are the ecologists and the biologists. Many of them take an iconoclastic view of tourism and argue that ecotourism harms wildlife and ecosystems. Such critiques of ecotourism cry greenwashing. Yet we see two sides of the greenwashing coin. Rather than calling everything ecotourism and lauding the positive results, as they argue, we argue that some are calling everything ecotourism and decrying the negative. That this does not acknowledge ecotourism as alternative to other forms of development and even to other forms of tourism. Recognizing many of these very same issues much earlier in time, be they in cultural, heritage, or ecotourism, Valene did not pull punches regarding the failure of responsible principles to be upheld in meaningful ways in all contexts. She said, unfortunately, well-intentioned travelers and even some officials advise indigenous villagers or remote rural residents, you ought to develop ecotourism, will create jobs and cash income. Such statements are often irresponsible and a disservice to residents because these well-intentioned advisors fail to fully comprehend sustainability and its complexities. Particularly in marginal environments, ecotourism is not a widespread panacea, nor is it necessarily sustainable. Such skepticism is healthy, yet Smith avoided the blanket critique that was dismissive of other possible outcomes and benefits of tourism. After all, she knew that most holidaymakers do not read the scholarly literature, such as The Other Side of Paradise. Rather, one of her chief concerns was that global tourism management is not keeping pace with the growth of the industry. She thus made fundamental calls for an applied anthropology of tourism something we have extended to an applied anthropology of ecotourism in our work. And what would Valene Smith say about these issues? She would go on to say these discrepancies are either real, the discrepancies in the scholarly literature are either real, they're a function of bias, or it's a methodological issue. To her words here, we only add environmental and economic change. We need to identify biases and methodological issues if we are to bring true rigor to the research on ecotourism. In response to the issues I've outlined, my co-authors and I developed just such recommendations for improving the rigor of ecotourism scholarship. It is in many of these recommendations that the legacy of Valene Smith can be felt. Starting with definitions of ecotourism. A first step towards more rigorous analysis is conceding that scholars have been measuring and judging a wide variety of things and calling it all ecotourism. This is the proverbial problem of apples and oranges, or false equivalence, describing a situation where there is a logical and apparent equivalence, for example, between outdoor recreation and ecotourism, or between conventional tourism and ecotourism, when in fact there is none. As we much more extensively elaborate in our paper, ecotourism is distinct from other forms of tourism, nature-based tourism, and outdoor recreation, in that it provides several distinct benefits for conservation. It provides direct support for wildlife and protected areas. It contributes to the diversification of incomes. It can support environmental interpretation and ethics. And most importantly, it strengthens resource management institutions, provides support that wouldn't otherwise exist. These original ideas for ecotourism overlap considerably with Smith's advocacy of tourism under specific conditions. Here she elaborates on what some of those conditions might be. To demonstrate the relationship between host and donor region, a well-defined, spatially bounded tourist region whose cultural configuration is understood could then be marketed to a specific segment of donor population to achieve a pattern of tourism that is mutually satisfactory to the touring and to the tourers. The extent that ecotourism is spatially bound, culturally appropriate, and marketed to a specific segment of travelers, Smith acknowledges that mutually satisfactory outcomes of ecotourism are possible for hosts and guests as well. Moving on to a second principle for improved research on ecotourism is the need to gather longitudinal data. Conducting rigorous research on the impacts of ecotourism requires looking at changes over time. Long-term conservation is an implicit goal of ecotourism, and longitudinal studies are needed to identify patterns and processes related to the presence of ecotourism, such as rebounding wildlife populations, resilience of ecotourism ventures, and how negative and positive changes accumulate over time. Smith's chronicling of change in Kossambui is well documented. How many of us tourism scholars have approximately 60 years of experience in their study regions? Maybe more so in this room than the typical audience I talk with, but that's a pretty extraordinary amount of time spent in longitudinal fieldwork. Her long-term work evaluating tourism-related cultural change sets an important precedent for understanding the cultural changes that interested her and the conservation-related outcomes that interest scholars of ecotourism require this temporal perspective. Of note there is, this is a screen capture of the dissertation of Smith from 1966. Very few people talking about tourism at that time. A third issue important for improving the rigor research is addressing scale. Mismatches of observation and conclusions seem to arise from a combination of case studies addressing a mix of tourist and recreational activities conducted at relatively small scales. Biologists in particular often analyze small samples of animals that come into contact with people, failing to capture broader effects, such as on entire wildlife populations or communities. This masks the degree to which patterns may or may not scale up to the level of populations and cross entire landscapes. This is even more problematic when that literature includes all sorts of interactions among people and wildlife resulting from recreational activities that range from winter sports to boating and even to dog walking. It has been cited as an ecotourism activity in certain literatures. We would say they're not actually describing ecotourism, but other activities. Also, as part of addressing scale is recognizing that all kinds of tourism, including ecotourism, have positive, neutral, and negative effects. Yet in biodiverse contexts, the ecotourism shield, as it's called, may, in many instances, cover an area vastly larger than the spaces where tourist interaction occurs. Indeed, the survival of many threatened species would not be possible without the direct conservation benefits of ecotourism activities. The goal of ecotourism is to conserve biodiversity and enhance the well-being of people. Then the meaningful overarching question is, what are the impacts of ecotourism at the scales that matter to biodiversity conservation and to local communities? Here again, Valene Smith was prescient. As noted in the quote there, the recurring danger in ecotourism is the matter of its size. The next issue to describe regarding improving rigor of research on ecotourism is measuring the non-economic benefits. Measuring the conservation impacts of tourism often entails gathering data on the number of visitors and the rooms occupied and the amount of expenditures that occur, as well as calculating revenues, number of jobs, volume of local commerce, and other economic indices. Income and employment opportunities as indicators of successful ecotourism projects are not sufficient to ensure social and environmental objectives of ecotourism are achieved. In the absence of equitable distribution of economic benefits, secure land tenure for local residents, and social impacts in line with existing social and cultural aspirations, ecotourism is unlikely to result in conservation. In our work, we encourage looking beyond economic measures of employment and income to other social, cultural, ecological, and political factors to understand the full value of ecotourism, such as some of these themes I've looked at in my other writings. Such words could have been pulled from several of Valene's contributions. Amidst efforts to promote understanding of these distinctions, Smith called for full cost accounting of social and environmental consequences of tourism that bring attention to questions of who benefits and who pays. Valene's earliest writing also emphasized this educational value of tourism, calling for training of tour guides, anticipated this critical role of education both ways. That occurs during travel. Such ideas are inherent to well-realized ecotourism ventures. She articulated this educational and experiential value best in the context of heritage tourism. Heritage makes history come alive in living museums and reconstructed realities. A day spent at one of these historical sites is an educational experience for the tourist and a source of community revenue. The goal of modern museums is to judiciously design their exhibits, the supply side of tourism, to generate demand. To this, we would only add natural history. We would say that exposure to not yet reconstructed natural history is capable of the same valuable and cost-effective community resource. In an increasingly urbanized and mobile world, ecotourism can be one of the principal ways that people get to know not just other cultures, but other environments. And the plight of endangered species, the direct effects of climate change, the loss of species, and so on and so forth. A fifth principle for improving the research on ecotourism is conducting participatory evaluations. Few assessments of ecotourism have emerged from the experiences and perceptions of local residents themselves. We call for more thorough analysis of ecotourism that includes evaluatory criteria derived from local residents, including indicators of success determined by EDIC as well as EDIC means. Smith would have called this emphasis on numbers, be it biologists referenced earlier or other quantitative tourism scholars, as something needing remedy by anthropological research. As she notes, most anthropologists are openly skeptical about results obtained from questionnaires or telephone surveys. The data is untested against indigenous values. Host attitudes towards foreigners may differ, given various types of visitors. Only through such actions are new outcomes possible. When governmental discourse catches up with the grassroots action and develops and implements policies that can be monitored, all who deal with tourism will benefit. A last idea for improving the rigor of ecotourism research is looking at the broader context. Drivers of deforestation and forest degradation emerge primarily from the soybean, beef, palm oil, timber, fuel wood, and small-scale farming sectors. Each of these agents of degradation represents a land use that often competes directly with ecotourism, particularly in high biodiversity regions of the tropics. These slides show competing forms of development where I've worked in the Osa Peninsula region of Costa Rica. The conservation value of ecotourism in such contexts, where it competes with other economic activities that are more likely to lead to deforestation, endangered species loss, environmental degradation, and reduction in biodiversity, is particularly high. Yet few, if any, studies make such direct comparisons, and instead only compare ecotourism's impact on wildlife to the absence of human activity. Ecotourism does not occur in a void of these other activities, and such analyses fail to account for ecotourism's role as an alternative to other economic activities and other forms of tourism. Smith again identified the need to distinguish the impacts of tourism from other ongoing processes of colonization, globalization, extraction, and market integration that affect communities and their environments. She was careful to put tourism into relative perspective with such other human activities. She notes that almost every nation seeks developmental capital and employment to support a growing population or to maintain high standard of living, and that quest generates social change. Academic energies and skills are therefore best directed toward the study of the role of tourism in regional development and as an agent of change and a search for solutions to problems it supposedly generates. Continuing, she says, anthropological fieldworkers have been criticized on the grounds that their touristic data is often ancillary to other principal investigation. Therein lies a strength and contribution, especially with reference to the problems of cultural change. Tourism is one of many influences, both traditional and innovative, affecting a given society at any time. Exact same conclusions would apply to the scholarship on ecotourism. As I've attempted to show in relation to a single writing of ours above, Valene made valuable contributions to the anthropology of ecotourism as well. Were time to permit, we could continue elaborating on any of the following ways. Smith was the first to publish on all of the topics in this list. She published on tourism behavior, and that's led to more recent writings on the right that address those same issues. She was the first to write on tourism and economic change and inspired others to continue that line of research. She was the first to relate tourism to community development, to talk about the role of women in tourism, to talk about cultural change as a big emphasis of her writings, talk about indigenous peoples in particular, talk about war and conflict in tourism areas, to bring in the idea of responsibility into the tourism literature, to talk about this discussion of alternatives between different forms of tourism and different forms of development, tourism in Arctic settings, tourism in Antarctic settings, tourist motivations, and of course, the anthropology of tourism, which she's most associated with. Looking ahead, her words still ring as true today as when they were stated in the past. As anthropologists, we help ourselves to gainful employment and extended social networking, potentially build a more peaceful world when we directly contribute to a better travel experience for both hosts and guests of all social classes, cultures, and background. The world of tourism and travel experience is out there. Step out and try it. To this, we would add better outcomes for the environment. Given that ecotourism is a conservation and development strategy being passionately pursued throughout the world, anthropologists' ability to explain human lives publicly is a responsibility that must be sustained. This shows a group of individuals in my current field site in Galapagos Islands that are passionately pursuing ecotourism as a solution to their conservation, development, and quality of life challenges. And with that, I'll take my pause here. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. So thanks very much, Carter. I really appreciate you um, talking about, the theoretical and applied contributions of Valene. And let's see, let's stop sharing. Okay, screen. And so I think that I'm going to talk a little bit. Looking at the time, I'm going to try and talk a little bit more, abbreviated. Let's see, I'm trying to get things. Okay. Try be a little bit abbreviated about some of the issues that I was going to talk about in this paper. I have a paper, and I'm going to really just talk briefly about who Valene Smith was and why we're all, in the anthropology of tourism, we think a lot of her. She's a very, very fascinating person, diminutive, probably about, what would you say, about 4'5", maybe with heels on. And when she moved into a room, you knew that that was Valene. Everybody would whisper, "There's Valene, there's Valene." She just had a very great deal of influence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about her, but I'm really focusing a little bit more on the applied aspects of her work because she was truly interested in the applied aspects of it, as we'll see. And I also wanted to say one more thing is that The field of anthropology tourism at 50 years since the publication of the Hosts and Guests book in 1977, or rather, I should say, the a meeting that Valene Smith brought together for a session at the AAA meetings in 1974 in Mexico City, which was the basis for her first edited volume. It's a very interdisciplinary field with lots of overlap between different disciplines. And if you look, we're looking carefully at what Carter was talking about. You need to know something about biology, geology, soils, ecology, et cetera. So there's uh, a lot of work in the behavioral sciences as well as in the physical sciences. So let me do a little bit of reading. I'll try and keep my remarks brief. Mid-20th century anthropologists rarely noted the presence of tourists in their midst while they did their research. For example, Saul Tax, whom my colleague Robert Rubenstein knew very, very well and wrote about his work in Guatemala. Saul Tax was in the town in which I am now, and he was there in the late 1940s, and he published a book called Penny Capitalism on this particular town, which is the tourism center of Lake Atitlan. There were 3 or 4 hotels, big hotels that were in Panajachel at the time, but he never mentioned a single one of them in that particular book. This in his 1956 book. Valene Smith, however, born on Valentine's Day in 1926, which is why she's named Valene, was one of the first to recognize that the anthropologist's lens for their ethnographic work was out of focus when it came to tourists and tourism, thus her call for papers at the 74 Mexico AAA conference. Valene had already led tours to far-flung places as early as the 1950s, and even then was an active observer of how tourism affects and could affect local communities. Furthermore, she's the only anthropologist I know who actually owned a travel agency. There may be others. This part of the chat really is focusing on her applied anthropology legacy to tourism. I met Valene for the first time at a paper panel session of the Society for Applied Anthropology in San Francisco in 2000, organized by another former student of mine, Matt Edwards, who's now the director of the Mount Airy, North Carolina Regional Museum, noted for its being the center of the Andy Griffith show Mayberry, together with Irv Chambers, Dean McCannell, Matt gave a paper, myself, and Valene. Nelson Grayburn was also in the audience and shared some of his comments on the topics that were covered in the paper. Well, I wanted to mention that the title of Valene's paper was, "I'd give a year's salary to go into space." I remember vividly Valene arguing for being prepared for space tourism. Now, we're talking about 2000, okay? And I wondered if I was hearing correctly. I had expected her to talk about the kinds of things I had read in her famous edited books, but no, it was all about preparing for tourism in space. In her convention paper, she called it the adventure tourism of the 21st century. She said space tourism would begin around 2003 with suborbital flights. Now, she was a few years early for that, and estimated that there would be millions of people willing to pay huge summer monies for space tourism flights. Well, I'm one of those that would be willing to pay millions, but it's not ready, open for mass tourism yet. She had attended the first space tourism conference the year before in DC and told the audience in our panel that anthropologists should be at the frontier assessing things like space sovereignty issues, health issues in space, Star Wars, and similar topics. Now, I'm sure that there are forensic anthropologists, ergonomic anthropologists that are working on these kinds of topics, but they're probably not in academic centers of academia. She published the convention paper, this one, in the Annals of Tourism Research the following year. So at this SFA, I was really caught off guard by the focus of her paper because it was so far off my radar at the time, nor would I have linked it to anthropological research and application. I suspect that I was surprised only because I didn't really know her yet, her own personal history, much of which was revealed in her 2015 memoir called Stereopticon: Entry to a Life of Travel and Tourism Research. Valene remarked to me often that she was not daunted by circumstances, and I think all who knew her would agree with that. One favorite story she told was walking into her first class at Los Angeles City College in 1947, a fairly young woman, to find an all-male class of GI Bill veterans sitting in front of her. After a moment of reflection to steel herself up, she marched in and began to lecture her first class in a very long career. She concluded her story by saying that they were the best students as a group she ever had. Of course, she said that about every group of students she ever had. They were the best ones. Dr. Smith was always forward thinking. I remember the first time we sat and talked at the SFA in the first decade, she carried with her a huge bag of pills of various colors and sizes. As I looked at it, she told me they were all vitamins, and she'd researched that they were essential for having a long life. Well, she lived to the age of 98 and outlived her 4 husbands, so I guess it worked. Valene was not only forward thinking, but she was practical too. Valene's long-term interest in being practical resulted in connecting work and research and, of course, travel. Her interest in practical future always connected tourism to current and future trends. She was always an anthropologist, and remember, she owned a travel agency, yet she was always a member of the tourism professionals community and participated in tourism industry conferences. The next section is really about some articles she wrote and how she brought in the applied aspects of tourism into anthropological studies. And I'll just mention a few of those. She wrote an article with Dennis and Nash and listed several items in which applied anthropologists can provide services to both the tourist industry and the host communities. First, by generating tourism markets. Second, working with travel agencies. Third, providing educational orientation research for tourism providers. Developing ethical sensitivity programs based on ethical principles of the AAA that, despite discomfort by industry clients, will help them make decisions that would avoid harm to the community and promote better options. And fifth, for hosts, suggesting ways to reduce conflict and controversy by addressing sustainability and carrying capacity issues. Now, to better understand where Valene was coming from, let's take a moment to reflect on her beginnings as a teacher. First, she was an entrepreneur for day one. She started teaching before she had her master's degree. And when she finished her master's, she was ready to earn her PhD. She hoped to get her degree in 1965 at the new UCLA, but the geography department there told her it was okay, she could work on a PhD, but she'd never be promoted beyond associate professor, and she would, in fact, usually be asked to bake cookies for the department. So she went instead to the University of Utah for her degree, which she got, I think, as we saw in 1965. All the while she taught and studied, she was also traveling, often with her mother as her companion, and later with one of her 4 husbands. Besides touring in the US, she also visited Europe in the early 50s and won a Fulbright Award in 1953-54 for Pakistan, where she and her mother did extensive traveling in northern India, Nepal, as well as Pakistan. They were often the only Western women visitors in any of the towns they stayed in. These experiences gave her a foundation for offering an academic tour for LA City College students in 1955. Her program director encouraged her to offer a course called Travel Geography Europe. It was the most popular course that semester, 1955, and with over 250 students enrolled. She then led, during the summer, approximately 47 of her students on a European tour for 63 days. Oh my God, 63 days touring, and for each person it cost $1,275, which would have been $80,000 per person in today's
How did it
money.
go out? So, okay.
Then came an around the world tour in 1957, an 80-day schedule, and one can imagine what boat, car, bus, etc. conditions were in those places: Japan, China, Pakistan, Egypt, Nepal, etc. in 1957. But she managed it with great success, and this led her to going into a partnership with an American Express agent who helped arrange the trips. The program continued for another 10 years and had tours to South America and Asia, among others. And then in 1959, she became the partner and eventually owner of Jet Age Travel Servants, her own travel agency, and she obtained her pilot's license in 1967 and soon bought her own plane. So she, in the 1950s, through her trip, she was already figuring out how to explain touristic phenomenon to the people she was working with, like her students. And she started publishing studies on many of her visits. As you saw from Carter's paper, she worked in the Arctic among the Inuit. She worked with Pueblos. She also the Antarctic, was in Greenland. She studied mountain resorts in the US and Europe, and also women in tourism. Her work ranged from the theoretical to the practical to the applied. As one contemplates her oeuvre, one cannot be amazed at the breadth of her work. She was a traveler and an anthropologist whenever she traveled. Now, when I saw her in her later years, she always told me the places she had recently been and the places that she was going to in the next year. Mind you, when I met her in San Francisco, she was already 74, and she continued her energetic travels into her early 90s, despite worsening vision problems. Unlike many of her contemporaries, thinking about how to apply concepts and methods to tourism problems was normal, and using applied anthropology and practical interventions she thought was very important. Now, she wrote a paper in one of my books, an edited volume I had, and the titles of her paper were very informative. The titles in her section of the paper were: one, anthropologists in the tourism workplace; two, contributions of anthropology to the travel industry; B, employment with a BA in anthropology; chambers of commerce and convention bureaus; networking and event management; tour guides and travel escorts; consulting and contract research. And then in the section of her paper on graduate degrees, she mentions the U.S. Park Service, careers in the World Bank and Nature Conservancy, craft entrepreneurship, guide training, et cetera, et cetera. So she was already always thinking about how can we make anthropology useful and how can it be important for people in our discipline. She was also very conscious about her responsibility to the discipline. As you've heard, she gave millions of dollars for what came to be called the Valene L. Smith Museum of Anthropology at Chico State University in California, where she taught most of her career. She also funded an annual poster award at the SFA and helped to found the tourism interest group at the SFAA and was instrumental in the development of the Irv Chambers Tourism and Heritage Student Paper Award, which is also given out at the SFAA. So Valene Smith's impact on tourism and its students is obvious, yes, I think, as we've seen from Carter's paper. And I'm just going to skip to the end and say that while Valene Smith has not influenced equally all of the colleagues I've mentioned in my paper, and I've jumped over many of them and many of the places I've done work. But she's allowed us, but perhaps an early 1977 book allowed many of us to feel that the study of tourism was a legitimate topic that was open for study, a beginning for the literature on the anthropology of tourism. She helped to develop frameworks into which anthropologists could begin to discern categories of hosts and guests that were otherwise almost invisible to researchers in the mid 20th century. In other words, Valene and her colleagues, such as Nelson Grayburn and Denison Nash, and many others that had begun by 1974 to lay the foundation for the anthropology of tourism, that now, 50 years later, we almost take for granted. But had it not been for Valene's peripatetic experiences covering the globe, doing research, bringing scholars and tourism pros together, and trying to provide scholarly explanations to her students and others on her tours to explain the phenomena they were seeing, the foundation of the field might not have been laid, might not have come until later, might not have taken a different direction, or might not exist at all. I'll simply close by saying that Valene made it possible for applied anthropologists to look at tourism with opened eyes and gave an acceptance to the notion that this was a very important area of human enterprise that desperately needed their attention. So that's my contribution to today's talk on tourism. I've skipped over a lot, but in interest of time, wanted to now thank Carter, first of all, for your part of today's talk or chat, and throw the floor open to any comments or questions. And feel free to just jump in. Alice? Alice?
Yeah, this is actually a serious question because I suspect there's something in Professor Smith that links her extraordinary variety and number of activities to having 4 husbands. No, I'm serious. Was
One
there
of her husbands,
some outstanding when you met her that 4 men in succession would want to marry this diminutive but very active professor?
I do know one of them was a pilot who worked in the Arctic area, and she got to know him very well. And I think she was husband number 1 or number 2. I don't know, Carter, if you remember. That was who got her into flying a plane. And so I think he eventually had a heart attack and died. But I think you raised a very good point that who were these other guys that were so attracted to this very, very energetic, very intelligent woman who, very
Yeah.
few of us could keep up with.
Right.
Carter, did
An
you?
influence on her.
I was just raising my hand and saying
Yeah.
I was attracted to her, even with the age difference. She was very
Yeah.
charismatic and very energetic, and it was a delight to
Mhm.
be around her. I do think that she outlived some of those husbands. They weren't just,
Oh, yeah, she outlived
Oh,
all
yeah.
of them.
the parent
sure.
relation. Yeah, she
Yeah.
outlived them all.
Yeah.
So, she had more
They
life
died,
force
they
than
died
4
on
husbands
her. They
combined.
didn't,
Yeah, but still.
anybody else have a comment? Rick, can't hear you.
I could make just a side comment here. You made some reference to Valene's involvement with or potential involvement with space. There's a connection to anthropology and space travel that maybe you're not aware of, but Ben Finney, who is best known for his work in founding Indonesian Voyaging Society and participating in the first voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti, also worked for several years for NASA. And I remember asking him about that, and he pointed out that there are some remarkable parallels between the experience of being on a canoe out in the middle of the ocean and being in a spaceship. So the connection between Pacific voyaging, space travel, tourism, and anthropology is popping up in all sorts of different ways.
Mhm. I do know that anthropologists are seriously involved in developing spacesuits that
Yeah,
are ergonomically correct.
yeah.
So there are, physical anthropologists that are employed by space organizations, whether it's NASA or SpaceX or whatever. Anthropologists are making inroads in those areas. But I think that Valene was really looking at what cultural anthropologists could do in terms of preparing us for a future in space. I mean, I know that she would have been the first person to volunteer on, suborbital flights and so forth if she had, lived long enough to be able to do so. But I think that that this is something that is coming. It's eventually going to happen. And I think another thing that's interesting about Valene's work is that she was always pushing the boundaries. She was always at the frontier of doing something else, and she was frequently the first one there, or among the very first ones there in this new setting, whether it was the Antarctic uh, or some of, working in the Pueblos and looking at the whole tourism issue and so forth. Yeah, thanks for that, Rick. Suzanne?
I don't get it. What in the world could anthropologists, other than physical anthropologists, have to do in space? I mean, what's the idea there?
What, yeah, go ahead, Rick.
Well, I think the idea was that the experience of being all by yourself, or maybe with just a few other people, and surrounded by what appears to most of us to be empty space, is an experience that is shared by Polynesian voyagers and by contemporary space travelers.
So it's the experience of the travelers. I mean, there's no
Exactly.
other
Yeah.
people to encounter out there.
Right, right.
How does that get into culture?
Yeah,
The
How
culture
does
of the
that get us
travelers.
into culture, which is what we're all about? I agree with you, Suzanne, that this becomes personal to the individual travel. That's good. Psychologists could study that. Where the hell do we come in?
I think that some of it has to do with, I mean, if you are somebody like Elon Musk, who during his lifetime wants to go to Mars, there are all kinds of things that have to be decided about how you're going to live together, how you're going to manage diseases in space. And this is really, how are we going to manage the social relationships and political relationships between countries that are all trying to get a foothold in the space realm? I think that that's what she was really getting at.
I see.
Tim, do you really think that Elon Musk cares about these things? I mean, he is not going to hire an anthropologist to say, help me plan a community on Mars. I mean, his ego says, I want to be able to get there and show you who I am. Again, we're getting back to psychology and something that has nothing to do with anthropology.
And we want to wreck another planet.
If I could
Can
jump
I
in there.
Yes.
Yes,
If I could jump in, I
point
would,
out,
uh,
yes,
let's go ahead.
Sid,
Yeah.
immediately NASA is consistently working with other major nations to put a Soviet astronaut in there with an American, with someone from a Spanish-speaking country. If you look, it's been a very deliberate program of having representatives of the major, most powerful nations in that capsule for maybe 6 months. There's also, of course, the cultural problem between having men and women. And this is something many women with feminist attitude know is a cultural adaptation problem. So I think the immediate thing is these multi-personal space capsules where people from very different cultural positions must live together in that tiny space for 6 months.
Right.
When NASA was still doing it, that might have been an issue. Now that private individuals like Elon Musk
Well,
taken over with their positions of power in the American government, this is all make up. It what might have been might have been, but it is not, and that's the point that I'm trying to make.
Carter, go ahead.
Yeah, I would
I
just
know.
add there that this has become a worldview that has emerged, that we need this exploration, that survival and perpetuation of our species requires access to mineral resources in other planets. The worldview that's emerging, it's growing momentum, it's being espoused by an increasing number of individuals. And there's where your shared phenomenon is across a lot of people. There's thousands of people sustaining these programs. We see the figureheads, the people that have actually made the space trips, the people that are sponsoring them, the Musks and the Bezos and so forth. But there's, massive populations of people that espouse these worldviews that far outnumber the number of members of some of the indigenous tribes that still continue to captivate us. So there's a wealth of opportunity for anthropological research on how these worldviews have emerged, how they've come to dominate and surpass, subordinate other worldviews in terms of where investment needs to go and so forth.
Well, it is important to also add that there's plenty of other fields that anthropology of tourism is applied. I was just reading a paper by a student paper on dark tourism. Do you know what dark tourism is?
No.
Dark tourism is the study of sites, rather the visit to sites that have had some horrible experience or have had some visible, some kind of unfortunate experience, such as going to Auschwitz is an example of a dark tourism site. It might be going to visit Masada in Israel, might be a visit to a dark tourism site, going to visit the plantation sites of where slaves lived could be another dark tourism site. Carter, do you have any other examples?
Sure. Holocaust museums, apartheid museums, even major battlefields, sites of any kind of tragedy or violence. And there's
So there is,
subcategories of dark tourism even that would get into more specific, histories, carceral heritage, and so forth, prison sites, things like that.
yeah, prison
I've
sites,
actually,
Alcatraz, et cetera. So this is just really one small area of in the anthropology of tourism, but but there's a lot of studies of, and a lot of people visit these places. Why do they go? What's the impact on these sites from the visit of these people? How are these sites transformed by the visit of tourists? How do they adapt to the visit of tourists? How do they change the sites? Plus, from the other point of view, how are tourists affected by the visit to those places? Do they become more concerned about what happened there and doing something about it? Or is it just a checking off a list of all the dark sites that they want to visit? Or is it does it satisfy some psychological need that is important to them? Uh, uh, I think we were looking the other day at on the ASA listserv. A colleague was looking for some examples of indigenous anthropologists, And this is a very interesting phenomena from the point of view of the anthropology of tourism. What is indigenous tourism? Is it indigenous people visiting their own sites, or is it indigenous people visiting European sites, or what? Who or what is indigenous? And so this is it's a very interesting thing that needs to be, as we began to see in the ASA responses to that particular person's request for some examples of indigenous anthropologists, we began to see that the term indigenous is a very complicated term. And so tourism and the study of tourism is one of those fields that is attempting to take apart these different kinds of little strings of relationships between the sites and the kinds of people that go there. I think Valene also talked about wanting to that tour anthropologists could do psychographic studies of the tourists that go there to these different sites and see what is involved in their decision-making process to go there, which you can see is also connected to how travel agencies make decisions about to whom they are advertising and selling their products to. Before I go to Sid Carter, do you want to add anything here?
Well, I was going to say that there's a paper I worked on recently that introduced the idea of narco tourism. And people are like, what's that? And the paper says, well, let us tell you. And it goes on to outline at least 6 different ways that people could think of what narco tourism is. First of all, it defines narco as a broad term for drugs, not just the narcotic opioid-based drugs, but others have often been, just like in the narco trafficking realm, the other things have been lumped into that category. But we compared, or I wrote about, people that travel to places to consume drugs, people that travel to places to see drugs being cultivated, like on, marijuana or coca plantations, people that travel to places to purchase and then transport and back to other places where it's not legal drugs. We also talked about things that people don't think about. In fact, there's dark heritage associated with narco trafficking activities, especially in a place like Colombia or Mexico, where you can see where Pablo Escobar was gunned down, and you can get a guided tour of that location by a policeman that used to be, pursued by Escobar and his minions. So there's even places where you can rent Airbnb homes that used to belong to the same narcos you can see on a Netflix series now, and you can live the narco lifestyle temporarily for a few days using a speedboat and one of these narco homes rented off Airbnb. So it's even become a bit commodified. There's tours that specialize in this now. Let's example how that one idea, narco tourism, kind of a fringe idea, actually can splinter off into a bunch of different topics all of a sudden.
There was, I don't know if they still do it, but there was also a tourism in Mexico that replicates the coyote experience of taking.
Yes, there was a documentary about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So people signed up for being a refugee going into the United States, but using coyote. Of course, it took place on a big farm, for example, but it replicated many of the experiences. So Sid, you had a comment.
Yeah, I keep thinking that tourism, in effect, is a product of neoliberal economics. And when we realized that the economy as we had it couldn't provide anything and couldn't provide growth, we added this notion of travel that, as you guys have pointed out, adds to the economics of a particular area. But this is a unique phase in human history. And I have the very sad reaction that by indulging this essentially with all of these things that you're talking about, what we're doing is reaffirming a neoliberal economics where people have to invent things to become entrepreneurs because we have no other way to distribute the wealth being made. So, I guess I may be unique in thinking about this in this way, but I do think it's something that should be raised in the discussion.
Okay, thanks. And Herb?
Well, I hate to disagree with my friend Sid, but It seems to me that the tourism, perhaps we could take it well before, well, there's Herodotus, there's Marco
Oh,
Polo.
Herb,
All
this is
these.
popular
Wait a minute,
tourism I'm
no,
talking about.
wait a minute, wait a minute. Remember the Grand Tour? Remember all these travelers to Venice?
European elites, the American
European,
elites.
exactly. So this is what we call diffusion. Japanese have learned to travel to everywhere. That was a very early one. Now that the Chinese are so wealthy, they're traveling everywhere. So that
Exactly what I'm
I can't
saying.
agree. I can't agree at all that it's neoliberalism. I would say it's the development of a very well-known pattern that was common in Europe. And furthermore, just to go back to the matter of resources, I'm thinking of what Boaz had said many years ago, that when you have a system in operation, it tends to get more and more complex. And that's what's happening here, more and more complexity, more and more variations of it, as we're hearing. Okay, that's what I.
Well,
Thanks. Thanks, Sid. Anybody else have any comments? I mean, we could, Carter and I could talk about tourism for hours, but we won't, we won't do that. So anybody else have any comments, questions? I just would say, Sid, I completely disagree with you, but I think Herb summed it up and quite well.
Could I say that they're both right? I mean, there's a nice
Okay.
book called The Experience Economy that talks about how we've moved from commodity-based industries to goods-based industries with some value added and the opportunity to charge more money involved with that step. Then we moved into service-based economies, and tourism was often lumped into that category. But now it's moved more into these experience-based economies, and they're all efforts to kind of create and capture more revenue out of nothing, add value along the way. And so, the amount of coffee that you're served in terms of its commodity value at a Starbucks is a minimal. It's a few pennies, but you're still paying $5 or $10 depending on the coffee shop you're in for the high quality, fancy experience and the different treatments. So there's a bit of along the lines. I think there's a lot of merit to those issues as well. But like Herbert's saying, and I mentioned earlier, I've been working in Galapagos, and people tend to have one idea what travel and tourism to Galapagos is like. But I'm actually in the process of elaborating what I call the adaptive radiation of tourism in Galapagos. You can't work there after all without being influenced by all the natural scientists and their focus on evolution. So I adopted some of that thinking into what I call the adaptive radiation of tourism there that has a common ancestor of the scientific expeditions. And a lot of the people that travel there now have an experience that largely tries to replicate that, going from island to island and seeing all the, the variation in the species as they manifest in the different locations there. But there's all kinds of other things now that would be different labels, like that slide I showed with all the different categories of tourism. You have voluntourism, scientific tourism, educational tourism, students going there. You have yoga retreats and wellness tourism there. You have conferences. You can go to dental conferences there. There's even a website that specializes in how to organize your conference trip to Galapagos.
Yeah.
And then there's micro and boutique cruising and smaller, more luxurious boats. There's dive-based specialty tours there. So there's this whole radiation in that one context. And I think that kind of supports what Herbert's saying as well. I think both those phenomenon are actually accurately describing tourism.
Mhm, mhm. Yes, Alice.
I'd just like to close maybe that I used to come up with the term welfare for the middle classes. All of those nice lady therapists, all of the opening up of office managers for nice ladies whose kids are now in high school. As there's more and more educated people who expect to have white collar jobs, then more and more white collar jobs invented. I think it's kind of the same phenomenon as there is such an immense increase in disposable income amongst so many millions of educated middle class people all over the world, in addition to the elites. There has to be ways for people to spend those income, the extra parts, in socially acceptable ways that increase, you might say, the social status of the person. He or she is doing a good thing. It's helping these poor people there. It's not doing any harm. And it's fun. and it's educational and so on and so on and so on. But bottom line, I think is where I'm getting to what Sid's thinking about is look at the huge increase in disposable wealth throughout the world, on top, of course, the billions who are practically starving. That wealth has to be disposed of and in socially acceptable ways to the middle class.
Mhm. Yeah. I, Marion, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, do you have a starting point for tourism? I'm surprised how far back. I'm reading a book by Johanna Schopenhauer in the 18th century. Schopenhauer's mother, who traveled throughout Britain, England, and Scotland, and writes very interestingly about her life, about life there. Or there was Goethe, who traveled, was it Goethe, through Italy, and Clara Schumann, for instance, who traveled through Britain.
Yeah.
And I mean, that goes back 200 years. That was a form of tourism. So tourism goes back a long time.
Absolutely. Henry
Yeah,
James.
there's also the Stephen book, Incidents of Travel in Central
Yeah,
America and
yeah,
Mexico.
yeah,
That's in the
yeah.
1800s.
Yeah.
There's no lack of this literature. Montaigne traveling down to Rome and Venice.
Mhm.
Well, what about Marco Polo? Was he a tourist?
I mentioned him already, Ray. We already got
Was he a
it.
tourist?
Or even Batuta.
No, he
But,
was there on business.
I've had this conversation with a lot of
Thinking about
archaeologist
whaling.
friends.
Yeah.
At
was
any
thinking
point in
about-
time, there was commerce and trade going on. There was going to be, even if it wasn't Marco Polo was doing it for business, there's people tagging along. There's people that were like, hey, I want to go, that tagged along.
Well,
At what point in time does the motive, for individuals at least involved with those commerce-based activities, was there individuals there that might have had more of a leisure-oriented or just an educational motive for being on those trips?
Yeah, it makes me think about
Curiosity.
whaleboats in the 1800s, where some of the captains brought their families, and their wives and children kept logs and diaries and interacted with people at every stop, provisioning stops. So,
And is there a difference between tourism and discovery? Like Humboldt, I've gone Humboldt. He was just interested to discover that whole area, South America. Or is that tourism?
well, what about, no, I would make the distinction between those who have a
That was
distinct scientific-
leisure,
a
business and
distinct
leisure
scientific
combined.
interest, who
kind
go
of
out
interesting.
to discover specifically from those who are going to enjoy the discoveries of others and follow in the path.
And
Yeah,
there
like-
was pilgrimages. There
Yes, of
were
course,
and are
pilgrimages.
pilgrimages for
Yes.
thousands of years.
Yes. But
Classical period.
I think the important thing is to come back to where we started with Valene and everything, and we need to wrap this up, but is that it took a long time for anthropologists to discover tourism. That's the issue.
Yeah.
And once we began to discover tourism, then we really had our eyes open into the radiation of like concepts and travel experiences that people were having, and we had not really understood the impact on, and again, the idea of host and guest is what Valene introduced, this concept of hosts and guests. Now, maybe people don't use this term as much anymore, but it is a handy way of looking at the two sides of tourism. But really what I wanted to emphasize was that it took anthropologists a while to note that this is a very, very important phenomenon that we need to spend some time taking a look at. Yeah, Sid.
Jimmy, Tim, just a quickie. Herb, do I remember correctly that Burton Ethel Aginski was studying tourism in the 40s and 50s?
As a matter of fact, well, because they were yachtsmen and they wanted to study other yachtspersons. I don't know that they ever published anything about it, but you're right in your recollection that the Aginskys, they were both PhDs in the 30s from Boaz, and
Yeah.
Ethel did some serious linguistics work.
But it really wasn't until Valene that we really start, and some of her colleagues, Dennis and Nash and Dean McCannell and Nelson
But again,
Grayburn.
as her pointed out, you can go back and you can go back
Yep.
and you'll always find there's a kernel of something previously that's later developed.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to
Yep.
end this up for
Thank
now.
you.
And I just we don't want to go on too late, but so
Oh,
I want to thank
can
you
I
all
just-
for Cheryl.
I just, I mean, this just kind of hit me over the head that the concept of guest and host, and how Montana is now responding to the fact that we are on the map for tourism because of the Yellowstone series. And everything is changing in Montana. The prices are going just skyrocketing, and yeah, everybody's pretty upset with it by now.
You make a profit from it?
Yes,
What?
but, you know,
The
that's
entire
the-
tourism industry in Australia was
Get in, get in
entire
there.
tourism industry in Australia was jump started by Crocodile Dundee. So
Mm, yeah.
So that's a phenomenon that's been going for a while, going back and looking at the places where these TV shows or movies took place. So, yeah, Hollywood. Oh, there's Tourism Central right there. So thanks a lot, folks. On February 20th, Sabra Weber will be talking to us. I don't remember the exact title, but she'll be talking on folklore as kind of like the stepchild of anthropology. So look forward to that on Thursday, February 20th. And then Tony Seeger will be coming in on March 15th. And he won't necessarily be talking about music, but something similar, his archives, I think. And then Kathy Fine-Dare will be talking in April on NAGPRA at year 30, I think, something like that. So, and then I've got somebody coming in April, still working on that to be sure. So thanks very much, everybody. Carter, thank you very, very much for being
Tim,
here and
thank you all.
help us all out. And we'll look forward to seeing you the next month. Okay?
Yep. Thank you again.
Thank you. Okay, see you
Thank
later.
you.
See you, Sid.
Cheers.
Thank you. Robert, always good to see you. Carter, thanks. Margot.
Cheers.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Marian, have a good evening. Push, good. See you later. Take care. Bye, everybody.